to Season 14, Episode 7 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
Good evening. I am Mark Bishop.
What is this? You trying a new opener?
Just saying hello to our audience. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening,
Good evening, good night. Yeah,
depending on when they're listening to it.
that could be listening at any time. We are, of course, reading The Conservative Mind.
That was a reference to the Truman Show. An excellent movie.
Yes, a very good movie. Speaking of movies, before we get into things, I watched Project Hail Mary with
Yeah,
Molly
that's
this
good.
weekend. Very, very good. Actually, just a really, really great movie.
I saw a tweet from, I think it was Bishop Barron saying it was good.
Mm-hmm.
So I know it was a Catholic figure that popped up on my feed.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
Yeah.
that's a recommendation. I'll have to check
Yes,
it out.
no, it's a very strong recommendation. It was just a solid movie.
Yeah.
It's based on a book by the author of the same guy who wrote The Martian. If you ever saw that,
No.
but that's also a good movie about a guy stuck on Mars. But this time it's oh gosh, why am I blanking on the actor's name? Very, very famous actor, the main guy in Project Hail Mary.
Ryan
Ryan
Gosling.
Gosling, yes. Ryan Gosling, who's stranded in space in a certain way. That doesn't really spoil anything, but very, very
Was
good movie.
wasn't he Ken in the Barbie movie?
That's right. He's
Okay.
also been in like everything over the past like
Oh, wow.
20 years.
But yeah, he's been in a lot of things. Him
Yes.
and Bradley Cooper
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
are very productive and
Yes.
have been good actors.
Yes.
And
Well,
Bradley
anyway,
Cooper
that's
is a director too.
yes. That's not very relevant. Moving to the book, of course, Conservative
Yeah.
Mind by Russell Kirk. This time we're talking about chapter 7. This is just sort of a little mix of several figures, starting with John Quincy Adams. Then we move to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Then we talk about one of my favorite figures who we've talked about before, Orestes Brownson. I think we conclude then with Nathaniel Hawthorne. Towards the end, sort of loosely grouped around New England. Transitional Conservatism, New England Sketches is the title of this chapter. So back in America this time, we talked about sort of the Southern conservatism that was sort of emerging a couple weeks ago, sort of around the same time that we're looking at here during the 19th century, into the early to mid 19th century. Some interesting figures. I really enjoyed the section on Orestes Brownson, but I thought the section on John Quincy Adams was also pretty good. Kind of ran into a similar problem we might have seen before with Emerson and Hawthorne, where it's like, why are they taking up, so many pages in this discussion? They seem a little bit like diversions from his main point, but also still interesting to read about, of course.
Yes, and I have to confess, it wasn't until halfway through this chapter I was like, well, who are the New English people?
Hmm.
I was expecting, like they completely missed me that it was like the Northeast, like New England. I was like, it's like New England sketches. I'm like, oh, new? Doesn't
Yes.
seem that new. Why isn't he? Where's the old? Anyway. So it was just kind of a stupid thing I confess to. And I don't know. Well, we can kind of get into it. I mean, the John Quincy Adams. I don't consider him a conservative
Yeah.
thinker. I never did, um, and I think and he was certainly an intellectual and all that, and was right on the slavery issue in the sense that he wanted to ban it and was really active in that prior to the Civil War, of course. And but he had that corrupt bargain to even
Hmm.
become the president. When there was a split vote and Andrew Jackson actually had more votes and I think more electoral votes, but the other two kind of conspired and that's why Andrew Jackson ultimately swept into power. And Andrew Jackson, I think, might be a better example of in its own way a conservative thinker. And
Hmm.
certainly there's a lot of parallels between modern conservatism, MAGA, Trump
Hmm.
conservative, and Andrew Jackson, especially with regard to foreign policy
Yeah.
and um, and bias towards citizens, I guess you'd say,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to uh, anyone who is within the boundaries of the United States who's not a citizen, like the Native Americans.
Right.
I'm not
Right.
praising Andrew Jackson with regard to
Yeah.
politics, with regard to that.
A good clarifier to have there.
No, but I mean, But I was kind of surprised by John Quincy Adams being
Hmm.
included. Um, and he mentions, the author mentions that there's not, he really wasn't that much of a consistently conservative speaker or thinker and writer, I don't
Hmm.
think,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
when we get into it.
Yeah, I do like the way he starts this chapter because the first section is really just, what is going on at this time period. And he
Yeah.
focuses really heavily on sort of industrialism, that America is sort of expanding far beyond, what any sort of Jeffersonian agrarian, right, community ever could have imagined, right? Sort of massive, population growth, right? Massive developments in industry, sort of in the early 19th century. Talks about, how sort of the local life, the family life is sort of disappearing to a certain extent, and sort of more direct urbanization. So really, what these New England thinkers that he's talking about here, a lot of what they say is sort of in response to these situations, in response to, well, how do we navigate sort of this transitional period in the country, right? We're moving past sort of the initial years of founding. We're sort of establishing ourselves as a real country. What exactly does any sort of conservative philosophy look like here in New England?
Hmm. Well, and he meant the author mentions the challenges for Jeffersonian concepts of
Hmm.
democracy when you don't have an agrarian society, which
Right.
is really his ideal, where you be somewhat self-sufficient, you kind of be lord of the manor, so to speak, and the property owners would be the voters. But when you have industrialization and you have people packed into more tight communities
Hmm.
and more of the common people,
Right.
be involved in democracy, and I don't, I think they would view that as pejorative. I don't, there are challenges with the Jeffersonian democracy and spreading the vote out among the people in this era. So I thought that was an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
But I did like he said, he talks about like the strengths of the older decentralized society. This is on 198. He says, man had to look man in the eye. The conscience spoke to conscience. It was a condition of existence comparatively harmonious because few great abuses could be hid.
Hmm.
And I think that it was more true of that time, especially before the big robber barons and the big industrialization and the what, amalgamation. Well, I don't know. The wealth going into fewer and fewer hands, and people just working as like cogs in a wheel in a factory. And of course, it's so much more spread out now. And it's kind of funny how of course, this was written before social media, I think, really took off in the book. And now we have um, it's odd because it's the exact opposite extreme where you can still communicate directly,
Hmm.
but without that eye to eye, that
Right.
contact. Like you can send a message to people, you can text them or respond on their Twitter account or whatever and say all sorts of horrible things. And there's like no consequence. You
Yeah.
see that with all the issues of the day today. And and there's something to be said for uh, getting punched in the face,
Hmm.
uh, meaning like as the person who gets punched in the face.
Hmm.
There's a lot to be said for that.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, I'm not advocating that somebody punch me in the face tomorrow,
But
but
you'll
if
know
I,
why if it
yeah,
happens. You'll be like the Bulgarian and the famous adage.
the old Russian proverb, the joke that I think a lot about, which is old Russian proverb: if you see a Bulgarian in the street, strike him; he will know why. And I don't know where I heard that from,
Hmm.
and I may not even be saying it right, but your brother um, locked his keys in the car again. Of course, this is an old car.
Again.
Well, this time he didn't leave it running. Uh,
Oh, that brother, the one that's
that
an hour and a half drive away from you.
Yeah. So I had to drive down there this week, but luckily he called me. I was already in St. John, so I was not quite halfway there, but I was in that direction anyway. And so I had a lot of time to think on the way back. And I was actually contemplating that exact joke for like an hour on the way
Hmm.
back. And I really do think, and we spoke of this, before the episode started, and part of it's relevant to this, because there's a concept, a conservative concept of original sin with regard to the criminal justice system.
Hmm.
And it's surprising how many people don't know and can't articulate why something is illegal,
Hmm.
or why something is wrong. I mean, it's wrong, and you kind of know why it's bad. But anyway, so that I think that joke is a commentary in a way on original sin. It's also a commentary on group prejudice. Because you're
Hmm.
picking on an entire nationality, and you're just saying that they're all evil. So if you hit
Right.
any of them, any of them, they're going to know why. But there was another one I was thinking of anyway. There was another joke that I really like that I was really contemplating the other day, and I kind of don't know why I think it's so funny. But it really makes my head spin a little. The Bulgarian joke,
Hmm.
and I don't know any Bulgarians. I don't even know if it might have been Bulgarians or Romanian. I can't remember what it was, but I don't even remember where I heard it from.
Yeah. Well, speaking of human nature, I like the way he ends that paragraph as well, kind
Yeah.
of going
Mhm.
back to this. He says, there's many imperfections in the society, but he says, man being the imperfect creature he is, this society was as well suited to human nature as any in history, best suited at least to the Aristotelian view of human nature, which defines the truly natural state as the cultivation of what is highest in man. And I don't know, it seems like very, very high praise for this specific period in time, but I think there's something true to that, right? The idea of like, well, we should be wanting the good of the other person, right? In sort of a just society. Well, it's very hard to want the good of another person if you never see them and you have no
Yeah.
idea who these complete strangers are around you. And you're almost forced to like want the good of other people if you very intimately know everybody around you because you're going to have to see these people every single day. And I think it is true you can kind of cultivate smaller sort of sub communities like that, sort of in modern America, right, in civic associations and religion and things like that. But I think we are far from that ability just in any average size city. You will not know 99% of the people you walk past, and you can kind of say whatever you want to them because you'll think, oh, well, I'll never see that person again. There's
Mhm.
no sort of reason for me to really think, oh, I want what is very good for that person.
Yeah, and that's what I meant by getting hit in the face because
Yeah.
like, if you're saying something really reprehensible, that's a good way to be reminded that you shouldn't do that. And I think, and I'm going to say another thing that's kind of absurd, but I think our country lost something when they outlawed dueling. Um, and you say, well, and you laugh, but when there was a time where there was like an honor code, and then they
Hmm.
had like a procedure set up where you had a second. Each duelist, somebody would say something defamatory about you or your family,
Hmm.
and you'd challenge them to a duel, and then your seconds you do point seconds, and they would meet to try to reconcile it, and it can be reconciled with an apology.
Hmm.
You wouldn't go to a duel if the person retracted the statement and apologized.
Right.
But there was a matter of honor, like, no, you are a cheating, lying bastard, or whatever the case may be. And then, but the problem was there are too many of them. People are too proud to resolve them amicably
Hmm.
and retract the statement or accept some sort of modified statement. But I think our political campaigns suffer from having zero consequences for the lies told.
Right.
And right now it's filing season in Missouri. So, like for all primaries, political primaries in the state, the filing closes on Tuesday. And you can already see people starting, even local elections, you can already see people starting to gear up, for those attacks. And anybody who's talked about running, they know it's inevitable that there'll be defamatory mailings sent to everybody's house that's a frequent voter, and Facebook or social media ad campaigns
Hmm.
that are unfair criticisms, and it's a cost, and there's no consequence because if you tear the other guy down enough, it might suppress the positive votes for them, especially among the people who don't know anybody, either candidate. But like so people will win,
Hmm.
that way. And there's what do you do about it? What do you do with that? You hold a grudge, I guess. You know,
Yeah.
what I mean, you can't go over there and punch him in the face. And you can't have a duel. You know, you can't have any sort of, there's no way to adjudicate those claims, whether they're true or false. You know, some
Hmm.
of them are true, you know, like, well, he filed for bankruptcy and he didn't pay, you know, this bill and that bill and he got sued. Well, that's true, you know.
Right.
And I think that's all fair game. It's public record and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, when they really kind of spread obvious lies and defamatory things, it's tough. And back then, getting back to the book,
Hmm.
there, I mean, it was rough and tumble, and they had, you know, partisan press, and they had, you know, their own share of lies and all that kind of stuff. But you also had frequent stories of the local newspaper publisher being tarred and feathered, literally, you know, covered in tar and doused in feathers and rode out of town on a rail. Like
Hmm.
literally, they'll put them on top of a rail, like a railroad tie.
Hmm.
You know what I'm talking about? I mean, they
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
literally
Yeah.
carry them to the edge of town and dump them on the side of town.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not advocating for that either, but there were consequences, you know, and I think I don't know how to fix that in a
Hmm.
modern society with electronic, and you don't want violence. I mean, I'm not advocating for violence, but there should be some way to figure it out where, and I guess a lot of it is just among the electorate. You know, the
Right.
voters have to say, you know, I'm just not going to vote for that person,
Right.
uh, you know, that does those things, or we're going to throw them out. You know, after it turns out everything you said about the other guy was false or gal was false. I don't know, you know,
Yeah.
but the author makes a good point that it was a different time, and you can get to know people, and you had to know them. You know, it's a smaller community, and if you're a known liar and philanderer and all that kind of stuff, it'd destroy your
Yeah.
business. You'd
Yeah.
have to move, you
Right.
know.
Right. But that brings us then to this discussion of John Quincy Adams, right? Sort of setting up this sort of cultural change that we're seeing. And he does kind of admit, right at the beginning of the section, sort of on 201, he calls them like the American House of Stuart in reference to the
Yeah.
Adamses, right? They're sort of the first, sort of hereditary line of presidents here. Of course, separated by a couple presidents in between them, but right, the first time you see like a ruling family of sorts. But he says, but as a conservative thinker, the second great member of what John Randolph called the American House of Stuart was vacillating. He had seen federalism die. He had come to believe, like Tocqueville, that the growth of democracy was providential. He felt the pressing necessity for conservative principle in the conduct of American affairs, but he never quite discovered how to fix upon it. Sort of the running theme throughout his discussion here is he's very much an idealist, is sort of his description, and he recognizes like there is a need for conservatism in a country for it to properly function, but he never really is able to articulate how exactly that conservatism functions and what exactly it is. Sort of the viewing it from the outside of like, oh, well, conservative principle is a good thing to have in society without himself being really a true conservative.
Yeah, I think that's probably an important part of it, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah, I would think
I
so.
don't know what it is or how to do it, but it's probably good. I don't know. I mean, that's why I was wondering, why is this guy in the book? And I do like, and I think it's true that he believed in the providential
Hmm.
forces at work in American history until he lost,
Hmm. Right, right,
which I think is just so American,
right.
and it's so true of so many of us that have run for office and have lost. It's like, well, yeah, God screwed that up. Or God's not involved in this. It's all just chance or
Yeah.
whatever.
He
And
has a really good discussion on that of like how he was a very strong moralist, right? In a lot of his earlier writings, very much talking about. I think this is a very conservative principle, right? Sort of the moral structure that is necessary for society. And he was a pretty devout Christian of sorts, especially compared to a lot of the other sort of founding generation, sort of
yeah,
vague deists and things like that. Went back and forth on the exact place of democracy. Some of his writings are very strongly against sort of just the tyrannical rule of the majority. Others
mhm.
are very just pro generally democracy, sort of just as a blanket thing. But yeah, it is that belief in God that sort of animates his earlier writings. Then when he loses that election, he wondered whether there existed any God at all on page 204. That's a pretty big switch to later
Well,
in your life.
well, he was egotistical.
Hmm.
I mean, he was the son of a president. He kind of thought he was entitled to it.
Hmm.
The Adamses, and I had a lot of respect. I have a lot of respect for John Adams, except for the Alien and Sedition Act, where he is outlawing his political opponents and put people in jail for criticizing government, which is abhorrent. But as he was an essential person to in the creation of the Republic, so
Hmm.
we owe him a debt of gratitude. But they always remind me of course, it's a parallel, but George H.W. Bush and George Bush, W. Bush. They're more like um, 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 more like business people in government.
Hmm.
I don't think. I mean, I don't think either Bush was a great political philosopher.
Hmm.
A lot of. I mean, some of his speeches, W's speeches about freedom and democracy in the world, were somewhat inspirational, a little too idealistic, I think, especially in retrospect. But I mean, neither one of them really was breaking new ground, as a thought leader. Not that, many of our modern presidents were
Hmm.
able to. But oddly enough, I think there's a lot of Trump speeches, when we read these back in about 10, 15 years, we're going to say, well, these are really, really pretty deep
Hmm.
uh, and groundbreaking or restoring. And I think the same is true. Like there's a parallel, I think, with John Quincy Adams, that he was more of a tactician
Hmm.
philosophically, than he really was. Oh, this is core beliefs. This is how to go about it to get
Hmm.
to establish the practical effectiveness of these core beliefs, and I'm never going to deviate from that. And I don't get a sense of
Hmm.
that from either of the Adamses, except for John Adams was such a patriot. That's a through line, risking his life and all that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
to create the Republic.
Yeah. I mean, he does make some good points, but I think it is in sort of that mindset of like, well, what is sort of the desired conclusion that we have, right, from these things? Because I do like what he says about his ideas on page 207, talking about sort of the modern industrialism and things like that, and sort of the materialism that's sort of ramping up. He says, rather than ennobling the public mind and cementing the social fabric, applied science speedily became the chief weapon of a gross individualism, which was anathema to the frugal and righteous Adams, the source of enormous fortunes divorced from duty, the instrument of unscrupulous ambition and rapacious materialism. And he says it's scarring the very face of the country, which Adams loved, right? And so it is this idea that he is very strongly against, right? He wants this sort of social cohesion, but more so it seems for these practical purposes throughout. And all of his ideas on how to get there are never really fleshed out. They remain sort of idealistic, but always oriented towards this like practical goal that he has.
Yes, and I had highlighted that same quote.
Wow. Well, there you
Yeah,
go.
great
Yeah.
minds think alike.
He also notes, kind of funnily, towards the end, he says he was always sort of anti-slavery, but it was really only especially in the later part of his life, after his political defeats, that he became very, very anti-slavery. And he kind of hints that maybe it was just for political grudges that, it just so happens that the more pro-slavery people were the ones who defeated him, and then he became really anti-slavery. It's like, well, that's, again, not a really good basis for your morality here if you're just really strongly railing against something because it's what your opponent supported.
Yeah, I don't know, and I agree. That's what the author says. I don't know that I view it slightly differently. That his criticism was more muted
Hmm.
before he was free to say his honest
Mm,
opinion.
hmm.
Like he was already been defeated, and now it's like,
Right.
well, now I can just let it loose, which is a criticism too. Because
Hmm.
there's certain political expediency with not really pushing the agenda. But there's also criticism of that that tactic, because the abolitionists were also creating problems too, because the reality on the ground was, you're risking war. How do you get through this?
Hmm.
Without losing a couple 100,000 people in a war like we did. So,
Right.
which is kind of an interesting wrinkle on it that people don't appreciate.
Hmm.
That, yeah, it's all well and good to say, okay, we want to abolish it, period. But if that means war, is that what you're really willing to do for it?
Hmm.
A lot of people weren't really taking that into consideration. And people
Right.
forget about that now. I mean, that's it's a big deal,
Hmm.
and all sorts of bad things come with war. But because like all these neocons are like, well, yeah, we need to bomb Iran, or we used to hear, turn like before the Iraq War, we should just turn the desert to, with a nuclear bomb into a plate of glass.
Right.
And it's like, well, okay, um, but do you really want to do that? I mean, if
Hmm.
somebody actually did that, would you support it? I mean, there's a lot of kids there,
Right.
you know. You're not just killing the military aged males that
Hmm.
are murdering people. You're killing everybody,
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reality on the ground that we're dealing with now in Iran. It's like,
Right.
okay, well, how far do we want to go on this? And that's true. It's true of the Civil War, and the people they're speaking out about slavery at the time. It's like, okay, well,
Hmm.
okay, what's your solution?
Hmm.
Invasion,
Yeah. But that takes us then,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. Unless you have any other thoughts on John Quincy Adams, that kind of just takes us
No,
into Ralph Waldo Emerson. Yeah, an interesting figure to throw in here, and I think he kind of
yeah,
throws him in here just to set up sort of the cultural framework for where
yeah,
Orestes Brownson emerges.
right.
Because Emerson is this transcendentalist, right? He's this very sort of literary optimist. I think is a word that he uses in here, right? It's just these very ideal things, right? There's the yeah, he says here on 209, he says, not only democracy, but those concomitant doctrines still more hostile to the traditional order, the ideas of infinite material progress, perfectibility, and alteration for novelty's sake, obtain their literary devotees among the talents of New England. He says Ralph Waldo Emerson is the greatest name among these literary optimists, right? Really just trying to sort of pursue this really ideal society. Very much Unitarians, a lot of them came along with this transcendentalism, so not the most orthodox of Christians, very much believing, sort of, well, it's all just the same, guys. Really kind of the 19th century version of hippies in a certain way, I think is
Yeah.
not an unfair description. But there is sort of a distinct American character in them. I think that's what he's trying to get across, of the sort of pursuit of sort of the nobility of democracy and things like that, and pursuing these ideals in this sort of American fashion. But I really don't think you can construe these guys as any sort of conservative.
No, and you're right to recall the 1960s, because there's a lot of transcendental. It's like a renewal of that movement
Right.
and political thought in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s. I guess I don't know if there's anybody that really espouses that now, or if it's kind of coded language that I'm not picking up on or something.
Hmm.
But yeah, yeah, I don't. I think you're right. I think this is kind of like to set the stage. Okay,
Right.
what's society going on? This is kind of like this interlude in conservative thought, where there's yeah, John Quincy Adams, which is kind of like the who inherited the mantle, I guess, and
Hmm.
then kind of this gap, this movement of transcendentalism and this deism and all that,
Hmm.
and then Orestes Brownson, who I'd never heard of
Hmm.
until you brought him up to me. And I
Right.
forget if you knew him, maybe
Yeah.
Russell Kirk's book
I
or
heard him.
something.
Yeah, I heard him from Russell Kirk. His
Yeah,
other book that I read, The Roots of American Order. He kind of just has a throwaway line about him towards the end about this great Catholic 19th century American political thinker. But yeah, I mean that kind of takes us in. I don't really have too much to say,
yeah,
except for one more note about Emerson that he seemed to kind of just deny that sin exists, and sort of
yeah,
going back to our earlier discussion on original sin and sort of the depravity of man. Right? If that's something you deny very strongly, well, you're not much of a conservative, right? Believing this perfectibility of man and things like that.
yeah.
But
Well,
yeah,
yeah, and I think he was similar to Rousseau
hmm.
in believing that the state of nature of your general instincts before you're corrupted by society is to be benevolent
Hmm.
and to be a good person, as opposed to, hey, we're all capable of tremendous evil,
Right.
and we have to work against that, and that you need a structure in a code, whether it's religious. Well, it has to be some sort of morality-based code that you also make into your criminal code,
Hmm.
so that you can't just punch somebody in the face because they're Bulgarian when you're
Right.
walking down the street. Why is that? Oh,
Hmm.
okay, because all of us are individuals that have inherent value, and shouldn't be subject to violence
Hmm.
unless violence is necessary for the defense of others.
Hmm.
That's generally a moral code, and of course, it's set in the Old Testament. That's more of an eye for an eye. But of course, the New Testament, which is uh, forgiveness and not turning the other cheek, so to speak.
Hmm.
It's supposed to be turn the other fist. Equal
That's
lefts and rights, they say.
that's
Equal rights and lefts.
yes, yeah, that's the
That's
phrase.
but nobody even thinks about. And I've always struggled with that because of course I had the philosophy degree, when I was a young lawyer and it was a never-ending frustration when we had sentencings when I was a prosecutor for 10 years. And so most cases are negotiated, so it's a done deal and the judge signs off on it. But on the rare occasions where it's not, or it's a trial and it was disputed, there's no negotiated deal, you make arguments, based on the
Hmm.
facts of the law. And there's always, in my opinion, always a moral thread through it.
Hmm.
And I always was amazed how many, of course, not many defense attorneys would want to risk a moral discussion because they're on the wrong side of it
Right.
a lot of times. But sometimes there is, they do make moral arguments about forgiveness and
Hmm.
rehabilitation and second chances, and they can be pretty persuasive. But I'm surprised by how many judges don't even they have a more mathematical utilitarian concept
Hmm.
of course, if you're doing it every day, you tend to try to just use a formula or something.
Right.
Um, the one thing I'm just going to say one little example, and then we'll
Hmm.
move on. The one thing that I always was struck by how frequent people, especially if there's especially if there's a murder, how frequent the argument is made. Well, um, what is done, essentially.
Hmm.
The victim is dead. We can't change that. So really, what the focus is what to do with this guy, the guy that killed them,
Right.
and it so devalues the sanctity of human life. I just always found that so offensive
Hmm.
and so counterproductive, and jurors found it abhorrent.
Really.
And I've heard, oh yeah, they recoil
Hmm.
from that, and to see I saw it a couple times in murder cases. I'm like, you guys are crazy
Yeah.
for saying, they don't say we don't care about the victim. They don't
Hmm.
say those words, but they're
But that's
articulated that an
yeah.
argument.
Hmm.
And it's such a foolish argument to make on punishment. Um, and even guilt, even in the guilt phase, it's really, really tough because people really find that repugnant because it's like, wait a second, this trial is about justice for the killing of this person. The
Hmm.
question is whether or not we're punishing your person. If your person is the one who did it, we are here 100% because and for the victim, and
Right.
they feel it.
Right.
They know it and they feel it.
Yeah.
So it's pretty impressive that people don't think about. And I think a lot of people just aren't religious. And if you read old closing arguments, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a rant. If you read old transcripts of old closing arguments, or like a book of famous arguments, legal arguments, like the Scopes trial or whatever,
Hmm.
they are so they are so there's so many biblical references in those. It is amazing.
Hmm.
And I'm not a biblical scholar at all. I can't quote chapter and verse. I don't know what the numbers are. I mean, I
Hmm.
know what the numbers mean, but I don't have any of them memorized.
Right.
Except for what John 3:16.
Yep.
That's only because that guy used to hold up a sign behind home plate in the 1880s or whatever it was. I mean, that's the only reason why I knew, or because of Tim Tebow.
Hmm.
But most attorneys, because that was what do they say, lingua franca of
Hmm.
the society, because so many people went to church and they heard a minister talk about specific provisions in the Bible. It was everybody knew the references, and they're all moral codes, moral stories, parables or whatever. Now if you're going to use those types of things, you have to use pop culture,
Hmm.
TV,
Right, right.
and now it's so dispersed, it's hard to do.
Hmm.
It was much easier when I was younger because millions and millions of people would watch Friends every week. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, or if they didn't watch it, they knew about it because people talk about it.
Hmm.
And that was like the Bible. Anyway,
Right. Yeah. But that does bring us, I think that is a good segue into Orestes Brownson, right?
yeah.
Because he was very much wrapped up in those transcendentalist movements. He says he
Yeah.
sampled nearly every dissent of transcendental times, Congregationalism, Presbyterianism, Universalism, Socialism, Atheism, Unitarianism, and revolutionary plotting, led by torturous ways to revulsion against private judgment, and in 1844 to Roman Catholicism. Right. So he's moving through all these movements, right, where they don't want to give you an answer about what morality is, right? Where it is just sort of fast and loose, right? Either morality is whatever you want it to be, or it's all kind of the same thing, it doesn't matter, or it's the progress of society towards some new material condition, right? He seems like he just kind of gets sick of that. And he's like, well, none of
Yeah.
these can possibly be true. There has to be one thing that is true. And so he becomes, I mean, it seems like one of the first major political figures to convert to Catholicism in America. All right. Again, I don't know the whole history of Catholicism in the United States, but to have, a very big audience, right? Because he was writing prolifically, like we've talked about in last seasons. And all of a sudden, he's this Catholic political thinker who's got a pretty large audience. And Kirk talks pretty often throughout this about how much he's forgotten, right? Just sort of in
Yes.
modern American political thought. And I think that's a tragedy. And he kind of pins it on sort of anti-Catholic sort of persuasions in the United States. Then, well, this guy doesn't really have too much to say about the American character because he was a Catholic, and that's sort of a foreign influence of sorts. But he had a lot to say, and he's one of my favorite political thinkers of all time, I think. But really, really fascinating step into what he ultimately ended up believing in.
Yeah. And I thought the discussion of Protestantism
Hmm.
and its effect on society. And I'm reading another book that's parallel to this, which I
Hmm.
mentioned last week, which is Triumph, this biased
Right.
history of the Catholic Church. And I just got through. I think I'm just now starting basically the era of French Revolution, so that's really good stuff. But the point being made in on was it 214? Maybe I'm skipping ahead, but
No, that's where I'm at.
I thought it was. This was an interesting thing. I hadn't really thought of this before, or if I had, I'd forgotten it. Maybe Bronson mentioned it before, but Protestantism descends through three stages. First, the subjection of religion to the charge of civil government. Second, the rejection of the authority of temporal government and submission of religion to the control of the faithful. Third, individualism, which leaves religion entirely to the control of the individual who selects his own creed or makes a creed to suit himself, devises his own worship and discipline, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And when I see people, when I talk to people that have, um, let's say, the saying is like fallen away from the faith or not going to church anymore, or they have some gripe with the Catholic Church. A lot of this, the concept of finding your own truth through faith and
Hmm.
your own relationship with God. I think there's a lot of benefit in that. But the without a structure of a religion that people always rebel against, then you're left in the wind, I think, a little bit too much. You have a
Hmm.
faith of you have faith of one. It's like a church of one. And people say, well, I shouldn't have to believe in all the things of this religion. Like all religions are terrible. Um, because we can't all believe the same thing. Well, we could. Um, it's not my fault you're wrong. But I think there's a lot of truth with regard to like, pulling the Catholic Church out of, or religious or any church out of any sort of power and having that subjugated, having the government be in control, and then you subject the government to limitations, and then you're left with, okay, the church is me and God,
Hmm.
period. And then I think you end up rudderless.
Right.
And I think there's just so much truth to that, and I think that's where we're at now as a society.
Hmm.
We got rid of church out of any sort of official capacity, and then and then all of our other institutions have been degraded. And everybody thinks, well, I shouldn't have to join a religion to
Hmm.
worship God. I don't have to go to a church to worship God. And there's some truth to that, but it does help focus the mind, except for
Yeah.
when there's yammering kids the entire mass. I was this morning. I wish they would allow me to make a public service message at the beginning of every mass before mass starts.
Hmm.
I'm half tempted to just go up to the microphone without permission and just say, there is no reason for a child to be speaking for an hour.
Hmm.
No one wants to listen to a child for an hour about anything. And in any context, in any situation, a child should not be talking for an hour.
Yeah.
And we were sitting next to a family had three small children, and they just talked among themselves and to the mom and to the grandparents, and literally incessantly. It was it was Palm Sunday, so it was a longer mass, so it
Hmm.
was over an hour.
Hmm.
Anyway, that's a whole separate rant.
Yes. No, I agree.
I can't,
Um,
can't remember what my original point was.
Your point was about sort of the
The Protestant
individual and
Bible.
God, yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
which I think is very true, and I think he hits on very well. I know he says a little bit earlier on that page about Burke remarking on the influence of Catholicism as a system innately conservative. Tocqueville describes a similar thing, especially in American life, where it seems like there might be a tendency towards Catholicism, and I like his point on 215 as well, where he says Protestantism cannot sustain popular liberty because it is itself subject to popular control and must follow in all things the popular will, passion, interest, prejudice, or caprice. And he says a little bit later, right, that a lot of these Protestant movements, not that they hate this or that form of government, but legitimacy, and it would rebel against democracy as quick as against absolute monarchy if democracy were asserted on the ground of legitimacy, right?
yeah,
These sort of ideas that just sort of seem like kind of medieval to sort of the modern American, especially the 19th century Americans. Like, oh, we're going to make all of these arguments about the legitimacy of authority. Well, that seems like something we did a while ago, right? It should be about popular control and things like that. And I see a lot of this. And we were just talking before we started recording about all of the people going through OCIA at our parish here, which I'm helping to lead. We have 65 people, 63 to 65, depending on some paperwork issues. Of these people are going to be, either baptized.
paperwork.
Yeah.
Why does the paperwork stand between them and God?
Well, it's in some cases it's annulment proceedings that have to be worked out.
Oh my
That's
God.
a different subject. But that,
Annulment. How do you annul something that God should not have any involvement in? Anyway, go ahead.
No, exactly. I think that's the exact, opposite spirit that he's talking about here. But when you talk to the people, especially the younger people, we're a college campus parish for the most part, right, who are coming into the church, right, they're making these exact arguments that he's saying here. And a lot of them have moved either in from Protestantism, a lot of them just from atheism, right? There's a good, 15 of them who have never been baptized Christian in any regard. And so the idea that's like, yeah, no, if you don't have, a system like this, well, then anything can be anything, right? It can just be transient, right? It can be whatever, right? You don't have this discussion of what makes something legitimate, what makes something true, right? You have in a lot of, especially more traditional Protestant denominations, you do at least have, sort of scripture, right? Whatever scripture says is sort of truth and good and legitimate and things like that. But you don't have anything beyond that, right? You don't have a means of saying, well, what does the scripture mean in this particular circumstance, right? And that's what a lot of people are frustrated
Right.
with religion and just with the modern world, is that any principles that we do have or can agree on, which is usually never, well, then we don't have any idea of what they mean for the world. And more often, we just don't have any common principles, from one person to the next. We just don't agree on any basic moral truth. So you just can't live in a system like that. You can't have a society in a system like that. If you want liberty, if you want true freedom, you have to have a system like that.
For all its faults, and the Catholic Church has a lot, um, it may end up being the last Christian religion.
Hmm.
Not like in a couple hundred years. I mean, are the Episcopalians, are they
Hmm.
going to be around in 50 years? These other, I'm trying to think, I don't want to defame any because I don't go to any of these churches, but the Rainbow Mafia churches.
Hmm.
I think isn't the cathedral the like the where after Trump got sworn in and that lesbian
Yeah, the
minister,
National Cathedral in
is
DC.
that Episcopalian or Presbyterian or
I
I forget
believe it's originally Presbyterian,
Presbyterian.
or maybe
So
Episcopalian, either Presbyterian or Episcopalian, one of the two.
whatever. I mean, do we really think that's going to last another generation as a Christian
Hmm.
organization? It'll probably be Unitarian at most. Like just we believe in a deity. It'll be a deist. It won't be really Christian, I think.
Hmm.
And I think if you look at it, the trends are the Baptists are still pretty strong in numbers and all that, but they have a lot of problems too
Hmm.
because they have a lot of fights over doctrine essentially,
Right.
and female ministers and that kind of stuff. The Southern Baptists have big fights over that too. So I don't know. I mean, and I remember saying something. I offended an entire table of people at a Rotary
Oh no.
it inadvertently about 10, 15 years ago. I was struck by how viscerally they reacted to it. They didn't say too much, but they all opposed my sentiment, which was, well, I mean, I said, well, uh, the Supreme Court judges that are Catholic are the best,
Hmm.
and I think it's because they grew up in a system that has rules that you're just going to follow.
Hmm.
And that's like the Constitution. The Constitution, you just have to rule consistently with the Constitution, and however the case comes out is just the way the case comes out. And I think there's some parallel to the Catholic, the trust that you have to have in Catholic dogma. I mean, you can research it and study it and I guess question it or whatever. But you either believe in the essential things for the Catholic Church or you don't, and you're not Catholic.
Hmm.
And so you either follow the Constitution as a judge or you don't. You're not a judge. Uh,
Right.
but I think the ones that didn't come up through a Catholic tradition are at a disadvantage,
Yeah.
effectively. But
Yeah. Well, speaking of the Constitution, he makes a really good point on 216 that I know we've talked about in the past when we talked about the American Republic, but about sort of lowercase c constitutions, where he says the generative principle of all political constitutions is divine providence, never the deliberate wisdom or will of men. And he makes this really good argument, very briefly here that I know we've talked about more in the past, that there is just sort of a character, lowercase c constitution that exists in a given people, right? Sort of through history, through providence, of what sort of God has allowed to develop. And then from, whatever sort of lowercase c constitution they have, well, then they can draft up, whatever the exact specifics of the government are. He says in Europe, monarchy and aristocracy ought to be perpetuated because the whole tenor of existence there is bound up with these institutions. In the United States, you don't really have that native monarchy, so republicanism is the best government for that people. But you have to really conserve, what is the government that is right for our people, and we have to conserve the character of our people that allows for that government to exist and to exist well. And I know we've seen this, time and time again over the past, 40 years, especially with sort of foreign involvement. And a lot of the times the wars that go really, really terribly wrong is when you try and just install a different form of government on top of a people that has never had any experience with that, right? Sort of the democracy building projects. Well, those people developed without that, right? Their common culture, their common tradition has nothing to do with American democracy. You can't just impose an American democracy on them. And I think we've learned our lesson a little bit. I mean, it remains to be seen what's going to happen in Iran, but at least a lot of the statements that I've seen have seemed to indicate more along the lines of we're not going to rebuild the entire civilization. You're going to leave essentially as much of the right sort of structure of the state in place, but install leaders that are more favorable to the U.S. But that's the only way that anything like that works is you kind of have to keep whatever sort of society has already naturally developed. You can't impose a society from outside.
yeah, and well, I have to confess that I was inspired by the elections in Iraq
Hmm.
and a lesser extent Afghanistan back in the days. Because they didn't have ID. Like there were Democrats who refused to have here in America. Well, but you could Google it, the images of purple ink stained fingers.
Hmm.
So they'd dip their finger in ink and they'd use a fingerprint. That's how they would know that you already voted. Because it takes a while to wash off that, and then also identify you as a particular voter in whatever tribe. But having seen the effects of it, I think you hit on something really important there. And just because you don't have a direct representative democracy with elections doesn't necessarily, you don't have some sort of representative structure. I mean, you can still have a tribal structure where you have a community like a town. I mean, I mean, of course, I don't want to equate the two, but like you have in New Hampshire, I think you have town councils, where people get together and
Hmm.
they just they have like in-person meetings, like a town meeting in these smaller towns. I think it's New Hampshire, and that's their city government. They select their leaders at those. They don't have like secret ballots, or maybe they have secret ballots at the meeting, but it's kind of a different structure, and so that is just kind of echoing what you're saying, like in Venezuela, all we seem to have done is taken out a couple people
Hmm.
and then supported the replacement with the internal governing structure, whatever that is, however corrupt it is. It's like, okay, well, you guys sort it out.
Right.
Um, and there's been some sort of sorting of personnel and among the powerful there, and that looks like it's probably going to happen in Cuba as
Hmm.
well. And then they're trying to do the same thing in Iran, which is a tougher nut to crack because
Right.
it's a religion organized,
Hmm.
and so they have that parallel structure
Hmm.
of religious leaders parallel to the government functionaries and intertwined. I think that's going to be difficult
Right. Yeah.
um, to impose or substitute without a lot of buy-in from the locals, and I don't know if that's going to work out in the same
Yeah.
way
Yeah, I mean, it
with
makes me think a little bit of sort of on the negative side in Europe, though. I don't know if you saw a couple weeks back, but essentially the English Parliament voted to end hereditary lordships in the House of Lords. So that's kind of the entire purpose of the House of Lords, right, as opposed to the Commons. And that just doesn't exist, right? That is just a natural feature of sort of English political life that
yeah
just no longer exists, and will likely never develop that way again, right? Sort of in this sort of democratic impulse of like, oh, well, all good governments are just as democratic as possible. We have to get rid of this, anti-democratic institution, and then we'll be more free, and we'll
yeah
finally be more English. Well, you're kind of losing something about what makes you English, right? If your sort of particular style of government is disappearing like that. Same thing. I mean, you could say, of course, for the, of course, Anglicanism is, just a heretical offshoot of Catholicism, but the recent installation of Sarah Mullally as Archbishop or supposed Archbishop of Canterbury, right? And that is a tremendous shift in the structure of their church and sort of the English way of life, even over the past 400 years that Anglicanism has existed. And it's like that's something different, right? You can't just say like, oh well, people kind of like it, and it was a general sort of democratic election, and among whatever bishops they have to put her in place, therefore it's the same as it always was. Well, no, something's different there. There's something very different about the way your sort of cultural life is going to be lived through that.
yeah and I think those changes were mainly possible because any merit within the House of Lords and any merit of the Anglican Church is gone.
Right.
They've been undermined from within, and so who cares if some, I don't know if she's a lesbian or not, but some lesbian woman is the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah.
It's just a joke now. It's like, oh, that's appropriately funny. And then you just hope that she wears a rainbow sash,
Hmm.
because you got to get the whole picture. You got to get the
Yeah.
whole. And the same thing with the House of Lords. It's like, okay, well, it's going to be half Muslim in about 10 years, and
Yeah.
that's okay. At least they believe in something, I guess.
Yeah.
But I mean, what was the House of Lords doing before that?
Right.
And how long have they been really great stewards of the English tradition?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. It's a much slower decline, and this is just sort of a symbol of that
yeah,
decline. Yeah.
the capstone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, here we go.
Yeah. Well, now we see
Now,
it.
now it's official.
Yeah. But yeah, he kind of, to go back to the book here a little bit, he kind of gives a very short section on Orestes Brownson,
Yeah.
kind of, looks a little bit towards the future on page 218, talking about sort of the possible progression of Catholicism in the United States. He says, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that the stern New England current of dissenting piety may reunite with the stream of orthodoxy, as it did in the person of Bronson, and wash American character in the waters of repentance.
Mm.
Sort of a hopeful message about sort of, the possible animating spirit of Catholicism might have to American life. And it seems like in some ways, I mean, that's possible. I mean,
Yep.
65 people, right here in this student parish in in Gainesville, Florida.
Yeah, and going back to our last discussion, I think Bronson's theory of the small c constitution of a people
Hmm.
is in fact reflected in those two changes that are happening in England. I think
Yeah.
his theory is being proven true because the people, the society, the culture has changed, and so it's not. And so the House of Lords, getting rid of that as a hereditary House of Lords, the traditional one, it makes sense because that concept doesn't make sense with regard to the people that exist there now.
Hmm.
And same thing with having a woman Archbishop of Canterbury. It's the same. It reflects who they are now more accurately. It was unsustainable to have those institutions the way they were without those changes under Bronson's theory, and so it proves him right in the sense that your government and your constitution with the big C,
Hmm.
it's going to eventually um, reflect the people and their values.
Hmm.
Whether you can't have them too much in conflict
Right.
without military conflict or civil war or whatever.
Right. No, absolutely. But that brings us then to the final person to talk about today, Nathaniel Hawthorne, which I don't have too much to say about. Another sort of author we're turning back to. His big point, the point that Russell Kirk is trying to convey, is that idea of sin. He
Yes.
says he restored to the American mind, right, and sort of after these transcendental movements, right, the importance of this sort of idea of sort of the fallibility of man. On 219, he puts this pretty well. He says, conservatism cannot exist anywhere without reverence for dead generations. The incessant movement and alteration of life in America, the absence of true family continuity, even the perishable fabric of American building, unite in tempting the United States to ignore the past. Right, and you see that very much with the transcendentalists, these optimists, these sort of idealists. But really, you need to be mindful of, no, I'm part of something bigger. And part of that reminder is I live in a society of fallible persons, right? Of people who do sin, right? Who do evil, and there needs to be punishments for those sorts of things. And I need to recognize that one day I'm going to join the generation of dead people, and think about, what sort of society am I going to leave for the people after me? He says that's just not something that was really in the mind of a lot of these idealists, right? But now you have this very strong figure of Nathaniel Hawthorne trying to bring those ideas back.
Good summary. Yeah, I
Well,
don't have
thank you.
anything else to say about that. I think it was a good point. I don't
Hmm.
know that I would list him necessarily as a great conservative thinker, in American history, but I get that point. That is a conservative concept of
Yeah.
original sin and the fallibility of man, and how it affects interpersonal relationships as well as
Hmm.
the government and constitution and court decisions and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I'll just read one more line from this section because I thought it was really good. It's on 222. It says, no, Hawthorne did not make the doctrine of sin popular, but he left a good many people uneasily or resentfully aware that possibly it is true. This is his powerful conservative achievement. The lurking consciousness of sin has haunted American letters ever since. Today seems to be experiencing a resurrection, etc. And I like that notion, right? You don't have to make it so like everybody's like explicitly calling to mind every single second of the day, like, oh, you're going to die one day, what sins have you committed today? But it always has to be in the background, right? The uneasy or resentful awareness that possibly it is true, that there is a judge beyond, sort of the political judges of the world, right? There's something more that I should be conscious of in sort of my conduct in society and how exactly we form the society. Relates to that, right? There has to be that constant sort of background awareness, or else you're not going to have a very just society. Seems to be Hawthorne's point.
Yes.
Yes. Well, that brings us to the end of the chapter. Do you
Yeah.
have any other thoughts?
I have other thoughts, but I will spare you. What other thoughts do you have about this chapter?
I
I've
enjoyed it.
listened.
I enjoy any time I read about Orestes Brownson. I think he does need to be more appreciated. Um, yeah, the other figures, right? None of them really strikes me as very conservative. I think Orestes Brownson is probably the most conservative one that we've encountered so far. So he balances out the other three that we're talking about. But it is interesting to see sort of all these competing currents of thought in American life, because it is interesting that you do have these, New England transcendentalists operating really at the same time as like Calhoun in the South, right? And it
Mm.
seems like, oh, those are seems like very opposite, ideas on the political spectrum, but that's, part of, the American political development, is that these things were competing like in real time in the history of our country, and sort of figuring out how to deal with these sort of opposite approaches to things, is something that we always have to keep figuring out because that's something that's going to keep happening, throughout all of our history.
Yeah. Well, and it continues to today
Hmm.
because you have this underground re-emergence of traditional Latin Mass at the same time that you're seeing communist flags flying at Democrat rallies. I mean,
Right.
it's like, wait, so that there's so much diversity of thought and belief in the United States. Um, sometimes, but that's, a challenge, but it's also tremendously interesting.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't know where we're headed.
Yeah.
It certainly worries me that there's so many atheists,
Hmm.
or agnostics, which are really just lazy atheists, or cowardly atheists, or taking Pascal's bargain,
Yeah.
or bet or whatever you'd say,
Yeah.
saying, well, I might as well act like a Christian because if I'm wrong and there is no God, then there's no harm. But
Hmm.
if I'm right, then I go to heaven.
Right.
Uh, something tells me God's going to know whether you really believed in him or not.
Hmm.
But I don't know. Maybe you can fool them.
Right. Right.
What do you think? I don't know.
I don't think you can. I really don't think that'll work out too well for you.
You just slide in unnoticed. There's a lot of souls. I don't know. It's a lot to keep track of. That's actually my hope. I'll be sneaking in and I'll be like, yeah, just let him in. Yeah, this isn't even worth the trouble.
Uh,
That's kind of, I want to at least be, I don't want to be like, I'm on the list where he's like, make
right.
sure.
Right.
Whatever. Anywho, but I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess I probably should talk more about Bronson. But he's so succinct with his political philosophy
Mhm.
about people have to be worthy uh, of this republic in order to have the republic exist for any period of time.
Right.
And the government and the society is going to be a reflection of the people that inhabit it. Yeah.
Right. I, of course, always appreciate his points and the
Yeah.
sort of traditional religion and things like that, that you do have to have the foundations there, else it'll all just keep slipping away again. I think he's very, very good.
Mhm.
Yes.
Agreed.
All right. Well, I don't have any other final thoughts unless you do.
Nope. I'm all
All
out.
right. Well, then this has been season 14, episode 7 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I have been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.